Hello and welcome to this edition of Investment Insights. I'm Jamie Gordon, editor at ETF Stream, and today we'll be diving into the buzzing segment, which is thematic ETFs. Joining me to do that, I'm delighted to have Ladi Williams, who heads up thematic and alternative index strategies at STOXX. Ladi, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Jamie.
So obviously STOXX, a long-time player in the thematic space. I think we're just marking the 15th anniversary of those first thematic indices. Would you mind walking us a little bit through what the rationale was behind those first thematic strategies, and just a little bit as to why you entered the space and where?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, we launched our first thematic index 15 years ago. And so when we look through that journey and take everything into account, thematic indexing fundamentally changed thematic indexing from what was normally or widely seen as bets on sort of broad concepts to making it something that was measurable, scalable, and investable. So thematic investing as a concept is nothing new. 15 years ago wasn't the starting point. It's actually been around for a very long time. In fact, you could date back to 1948 to the technology fund which was launched, which is widely cited as the first thematic fund. And what was happening then was there was trying to provide investors a way to gain access and exposure to the fast-growing adoption in technology. When we moved along time, we saw companies being organized into sectors and industries and a bit more structure coming into play. And that very same television fund actually became more of a sector fund. But then around the early parts of the last decade, thematic investing was being coined. And what that was designed to do was to give exposure to some of these disruptive mega trends that were having sort of structural changes in society, in environment, and in business, which led us to create our first thematic index, which was the STOXX infrastructure suite of indices. So investors were looking for exposure to infrastructure, but from a new lens, rather than the traditional sectorial approach. It was one that thematic investing, where it allows you to cut across geographies, industries, and sectors, and that is what we were able to achieve, and it allowed us to measure companies that are participating in that, measure the performance of companies that are participating in that space. And with the advent of ETFs, what indices have done is this accelerated that growth by providing a low-cost way of accessing these strategies through ETFs.
And sort of drawing out those points there, can you tell us a little bit about how the definition of thematic investing or thematic indexing has changed since those early days, as more of those disruptive sort of mega trends and mega forces have come through, been identified, and sort of packaged in investment products? And also, can you mention a little bit about how investors are treating those strategies alongside sector ETFs or indices within portfolios? Yeah,
sure. I think the best way to answer that question is to look at the evolution of thematic indices over time. So I've been in the space for quite a while, and I think there's two observable trends that I've seen in terms of thematic indices. The first one is focus. So if I look back to the indices we first created 15 years ago, it wasn't uncommon to have 300 companies in a thematic index. That just shows you how broad the concept was there in terms of trying to get exposure to some of these sort of technology themes. It was all about sort of huge mega trends. And now when we look at thematic indices, the focus is a lot narrower. So we've gone from like indices that had 300 components right about to some now that only have around 30. The focus is a lot more targeted. So themes such as AI, quantum computing, you'll see that the components are around 30 to 40. And that brings me on to the next point. What has led to that is structure, which has been enabled by technology, data, innovations in these areas that have allowed us to be more specific in how we look at company exposure and target companies that are relevant to a theme. So that's looking at using more traditional data sets such as revenues, where there's taxonomies that allow us to go really deep into a particular theme. We're seeing more forward-looking data sets such as patents now, and also leveraging of AI to scrape company websites and to review earnings transcripts. And even at STOXX, we've come up with a thematic framework which helps guide the construction of thematic indices and help investors understand how a particular theme evolves through the progression of it being embryonic right to the point where it's more mature and can be classified as a sector. And to your point around sectors and thematic indices, we don't necessarily see them as being playing off against each other. They're very much complementary. We looked at the data. We're seeing that there's still inflows into sector strategies this year as well as thematic. So investors are finding uses for both of those.
To your point there about the thematic suite getting a lot more granular, and obviously the gamut of themes being captured nowadays and the methods used to capture them is getting more innovative, and there's a huge amount of competition in the space. I'd love to hear from your vantage point as sort of a long-time operator in this space. Which themes have had the sort of most long-term relevance and long-term resilience?
So in that 15 years since we've been participating in thematic indices, we've launched over 70 different indices. And so at STOXX, we classify our indices across 3 broad categories: future technology, social demographics, and environmental. Actually, recently we did a study whereby we ran over the last decade the performance of these thematic indices. And what we noticed was that in an annualized basis over the last decade, thematic strategies have outperformed by 6.8%. The categories that performed the best were future technology and social demographics. Some of the standout performers in future technology was AI, extremely topical at the moment. We're seeing now some of those capital expenditures that are rising actually bearing fruit across industries and being integrated into workflows. Last year, we saw defence being one of those very sort of strongly performing indices. So those are the ones which are proving to be like strong performers going into the future. I think if I have to think about resilience, I think we can circle back to where we started this conversation and our first thematic index, which was based on infrastructure. So in that time, we've seen how the infrastructure theme has evolved from our very first index, which was more around bringing in new sectors, to how infrastructure has embedded new age thinking. And by that, I mean how infrastructure started to become more technology driven. So like smart infrastructure. So still very much the infrastructure theme, but a new way of looking at it that came into play. And now even more recently, we're seeing regional plays on infrastructure. So European infrastructure, for instance, this year has been very topical, and that's policy driven. So you can see how we kind of gone round full circle from the very first index to different flavors of that in this day, and how it's still being resilient. And I think the key thing to remember when it comes to thematic investing is that you're betting on long-term trends, which might not necessarily, the potential might not necessarily materialize right from the beginning, but it can do later on in the future.
I think that infrastructure one is a perfect example of the sort of sector sitting next to the theme, something that really sits at the intersection there, depending on, one, how you're classifying the exposure, and two, I guess the story behind it as well.
Exactly.
Brilliant. Ladi, thank you so much for your insights. And thank you very much for joining us for this edition of Investment Insights. Do join us again next time, where we're joined by Olivier Souliac of DWS, who'll be giving us the issuer perspective on how asset managers are thinking about this space. Until then, take care.